The scorching sun beat down mercilessly on the hills of Gibeah, where King Saul's palace stood like a fortress carved from the very stones of Israel. The year was around 1020 BCE, and the newly established kingdom trembled under the weight of constant warfare against the Philistines. Inside the royal chambers, Saul paced restlessly, his tall frame casting long shadows across the earthen floor. The crown that had once felt like divine blessing now seemed to burn against his temples. Outside, the sounds of preparation for war echoed through the courtyard. Soldiers sharpened bronze weapons, horses whinnied in the stables, and servants hurried back and forth carrying supplies. But Saul's mind was elsewhere, consumed by a vision that haunted his every waking moment. Her name was Michal, and she was not just any woman. She was the daughter of a wealthy merchant from a neighboring tribe, promised in marriage to strengthen political alliances. Yet when Saul had first laid eyes on her during a diplomatic feast, something had ignited within him that went far beyond duty or strategy. The king's calloused hands gripped the stone windowsill as he gazed out at the dusty horizon. His dark hair, streaked with premature grey from the burdens of leadership, fell across his weathered face. At 43, Saul had already endured more battles than most men could imagine, but this internal war was proving far more treacherous than any Philistine army. The woman occupied his thoughts during council meetings, haunted his dreams, and whispered promises of forbidden pleasure that no crown could fulfill. "My lord," came a voice from behind him. Jonathan, his eldest son and heir, stood in the doorway wearing his battle armor. The young prince's face bore the same strong features as his father, but his eyes held a clarity that Saul's had lost. "The commanders are waiting for your orders regarding the advance on Philistine territory." Saul turned slowly, his expression masking the turmoil within. "Tell them we march at dawn," he replied, his voice carrying the authority that had united the 12 tribes under his rule. But even as he spoke of war, his mind conjured images of Michal's dark eyes and the way her silk robes had moved like water when she walked. The memory sent fire through his veins. Jonathan studied his father's face with growing concern. "Father, you seem distant." "The men need to see their king's strength, especially now. The Philistines have been gathering forces near the valley of Elah. This battle could determine the future of our kingdom." The words struck Saul like cold water. His kingdom, everything he had built, everything God had entrusted to him, hung in the balance. Yet even this sobering reality couldn't extinguish the flames of his obsession. If anything, the prospect of death in battle only intensified his desire to possess what he couldn't have. Life was fragile, and he was tired of denying himself the one thing that could bring him true satisfaction. As the evening shadows lengthened, Saul dismissed his son and retreated to his private chambers. The room was sparse by royal standards: a simple bed, a wooden table, and weapons hanging on the walls. This was the room of a warrior king, not a pleasure-seeking monarch, yet tonight it felt like a prison. He had sent messengers to Michal's father, ostensibly to discuss trade agreements, but his true motive burned like a brand in his chest. The oil lamps flickered, casting dancing shadows that seemed to mock his torment. Outside he could hear the laughter of his soldiers around their campfires, their voices carrying stories of home and loved ones. But Saul had no peace, no simple joy. The crown had isolated him, placed him on a pedestal where desire became dangerous and love could destroy kingdoms. If you're enjoying this epic tale of power and forbidden desire, hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. King Saul's story is just beginning, and you won't want to miss what happens next. As midnight approached, a servant brought news that would change everything. "My lord, messengers have arrived from the merchant Ahimelech. His daughter Michal will be arriving tomorrow for the negotiations." The servant's words hit Saul like lightning. Tomorrow she would be here within reach, and he would have to maintain the facade of a righteous king while his heart burned with unholy desire. Saul dismissed the servant and stood alone in his chamber, the weight of his crown feeling heavier than ever. Through the narrow window, he could see the stars that had once seemed to smile upon his reign. Now they appeared distant and cold, like the eyes of a god who was watching his chosen king walk toward damnation. The first chapter of his downfall was about to begin, and Saul knew that once he saw Michal again, there would be no turning back from the path that would ultimately destroy everything he had built. The desert wind howled through the palace corridors, carrying with it the scent of approaching storms. Change was coming to Israel, and it would arrive wearing the face of a woman who would prove more dangerous to King Saul than any army he had ever faced. Dawn broke over Gibeah with the harsh beauty of the desert sunrise, painting the ancient stones of Saul's palace in shades of gold and crimson. The king had not slept. Instead, he had spent the long hours pacing his chambers like a caged lion, alternating between anticipation and self-recrimination. Today Michal would arrive, and with her would come the test that would either strengthen his resolve or shatter his soul completely. The palace courtyard bustled with activity as servants prepared for the diplomatic reception. Carpets were laid out, bronze vessels polished until they gleamed, and the finest wines brought up from the royal cellars. To any observer, this appeared to be standard protocol for receiving important guests. Only Saul knew the true fire that burned beneath these preparations. From his elevated position on the palace steps, Saul watched the horizon with eyes that had seen countless enemies approach these same hills. But today he awaited not an army, but a single woman who wielded more power over him than any weapon forged by man. His royal robes, deep purple trimmed with gold, felt stifling in the morning heat. The crown that had once been his pride now seemed to press down upon his skull like a curse. "Father," Jonathan approached, his young face etched with concern that had deepened overnight. "The scouts report that Ahimelech's caravan is less than an hour away. Are you certain about these negotiations? The elders whisper that his terms for alliance are unusual." Saul's jaw tightened. The elders suspected nothing of his true motives, but their political instincts sensed something amiss. "The kingdom needs strong alliances, my son. Sometimes a king must make difficult choices." The words tasted like ash in his mouth, but they carried enough truth to silence Jonathan's questions. As if summoned by fate itself, a dust cloud appeared on the eastern road. The caravan was larger than expected, dozens of camels loaded with goods, armed guards on horseback, and in the center a covered litter that carried precious cargo. Saul's heart began to race as he recognized the approaching procession. She was there, hidden behind silk curtains, drawing closer with each passing moment. The courtyard fell silent as the caravan entered the palace gates. Servants rushed forward to tend to the animals and guests, but all eyes were drawn to the ornate litter as it was carefully lowered to the ground. Ahimelech emerged first, a portly man with intelligent eyes and a merchant's calculating smile. He was followed by his retinue of advisors and guards, but Saul barely noticed them. Then the curtains parted, and Michal stepped into the sunlight. Time seemed to stop as Saul gazed upon her. She was even more beautiful than his tortured memory had painted her, tall and graceful, with olive skin that glowed in the morning light and dark hair that cascaded over her shoulders like black silk. Her dress was simple yet elegant, the kind of understated luxury that spoke of true wealth and refinement. But it was her eyes that captured him completely. Deep brown pools that seemed to hold secrets and promises that made his royal blood surge with desperate longing. "Your Majesty," Ahimelech bowed deeply, his voice carrying the practiced smoothness of a seasoned negotiator. "I present my daughter Michal, who has heard much of the great King Saul and his mighty kingdom." Michal curtsied with fluid grace, her eyes meeting Saul's for just a moment, long enough to send fire racing through his veins. "The honor is mine, Your Majesty. Your reputation as a warrior and leader reaches far beyond Israel's borders." Her voice was like honey mixed with wine, sweet yet intoxicating. Saul found himself stepping forward, drawn by an invisible force that he couldn't resist. "Welcome to my kingdom, Lady Michal. Your beauty graces these ancient halls." The words came out more intimate than intended, and he saw a flicker of something, surprise, curiosity, in her dark eyes. The formal reception proceeded according to protocol, but beneath the surface, currents of tension and desire flowed like underground rivers. Saul found himself studying Michal's every gesture, the way she moved her hands when she spoke, the slight tilt of her head when she listened, the curve of her lips when she smiled. Each detail carved itself into his memory with painful clarity. During the feast that evening, Saul positioned himself where he could observe Michal without appearing obvious. The great hall was filled with the sounds of conversation, laughter, and music, but he heard only her voice when she spoke. She was intelligent, he realized, not just beautiful but sharp-witted and perceptive. This only intensified his fascination. Here was a woman who could match him intellectually, who could understand the burdens of leadership and the loneliness of power. "She is quite remarkable," Jonathan murmured, following his father's gaze. Ahimelech has raised her well. She would make a strong alliance for some fortunate nobleman. The words hit Saul like a physical blow. The reminder that Michal was promised to another, that she was here only as part of political maneuvering, sent jealousy coursing through him like poison. His grip tightened on his wine cup until his knuckles went white. As the evening wore on, Saul found opportunities to speak with Michal privately. He showed her the palace, pointing out tapestries and treasures, but his real purpose was simply to be near her, to hear her voice and bask in her presence. She listened attentively to his stories of battles and conquests, asking intelligent questions that showed she understood the complexities of warfare and statecraft. "You carry great burdens, Your Majesty," she said softly, as they stood on a balcony overlooking the moonlit countryside. "The crown suits you, but I can see the weight it places upon your shoulders." Her insight pierced him like an arrow. Here was someone who truly saw him, not just the king, but the man beneath the crown. The loneliness that had plagued him for years seemed to ease in her presence, replaced by a warmth that he had almost forgotten existed. "Few understand the isolation of leadership," he replied, his voice husky with emotion. "A king is surrounded by subjects and advisers, yet often stands alone." Michal turned to face him fully, and in the moonlight she looked like a vision from the ancient songs. "Perhaps," she said quietly, "even kings need someone who sees them as simply human." The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility and danger. Saul felt himself leaning closer, drawn by her beauty and the promise of understanding in her eyes. But then the sound of approaching footsteps broke the spell, and they stepped apart as Jonathan appeared with news of tomorrow's schedule. Later, alone in his chambers, Saul lay awake staring at the ceiling. Michal's presence had awakened something in him that went beyond mere desire. It was a hunger for connection, for someone who could see past his crown to the man beneath. But she was forbidden to him, promised to another, and his pursuit of her could destroy everything he had built. Yet as he closed his eyes, her image filled his mind, and he knew with terrible certainty that he was already lost. The obsession that had been smoldering in his heart had burst into full flame, and like all fires, it would consume everything in its path until nothing remained but ash and regret. 3 days had passed since Michal's arrival, and the palace of Gibeah had become a battlefield where King Saul fought his most dangerous war, the one raging within his own heart. The diplomatic negotiations with Ahimelech had proceeded smoothly on the surface. Trade agreements were discussed, territorial boundaries clarified, and mutual defense pacts outlined. But beneath this veneer of royal protocol, Saul's obsession had grown like a cancer, consuming his thoughts and poisoning his judgment. The morning sun cast long shadows across the palace courtyard as Saul stood at his favorite vantage point, watching Michal walk through the gardens below. She moved with an elegance that seemed almost ethereal, her simple linen dress catching the light breeze as she examined the olive trees and flowering jasmine. Every gesture was poetry in motion, and Saul found himself memorizing each detail like a man dying of thirst who had found an oasis. "My lord," came the voice of Abner, his military commander and closest advisor. The grizzled veteran's weathered face bore the scars of countless battles, and his eyes held the wisdom that came from years of loyal service. "The Philistine scouts have been more active along our borders. Perhaps we should conclude these negotiations and focus on military preparations." Saul turned slowly, his expression carefully controlled. "The negotiations require careful attention, Abner. An alliance with Ahimelech's people could provide crucial resources for our campaigns." The words were logical, even true, but they masked the real reason he was reluctant to see the diplomatic mission end. Abner studied his king's face with the practiced eye of a man who had served him through victory and defeat. "With respect, my lord, you seem different since our guests arrived. The men have noticed. They need to see their king's mind focused on the challenges ahead." The observation stung because it was accurate. Saul knew his behavior had changed, that his attention wandered during council meetings, and his responses to military reports lacked their usual sharp focus. But knowing this and being able to change it were entirely different matters. Michal had become the center around which his world revolved, and everything else, including his duties as king, felt secondary. That afternoon, fate provided Saul with the opportunity he had been both craving and dreading. Ahimelech and his advisors were occupied with examining the palace's defensive fortifications, leaving Michal alone in the library, a small chamber filled with scrolls and tablets that contained the wisdom of ages. When Saul found her there, she was reading by the light streaming through a narrow window, completely absorbed in an ancient text. "Lady Michal," he said softly, not wanting to startle her, "I hope you're finding our humble collection interesting." She looked up with a smile that sent his pulse racing. "Your Majesty, these scrolls are fascinating. This one contains military strategies from the campaigns of Joshua. Your scribes have preserved remarkable knowledge." Her intelligence only intensified his attraction. Here was a woman who could appreciate not just the glory of conquest, but the careful planning and wisdom that made victory possible. "Few take interest in such matters," he replied, moving closer. "Most see only the surface glory, not the deeper complexities of leadership. Perhaps that's because few have the opportunity to look beyond the surface," she said, her dark eyes meeting his with an intensity that made his breath catch. "You've accomplished what many thought impossible, uniting the tribes, establishing a kingdom, bringing order from chaos. But I imagine the cost has been significant." The understanding in her voice nearly broke his composure. For so long he had carried the burdens of kingship alone, making decisions that affected thousands, while having no one who truly comprehended the weight of such responsibility. Here was someone who not only understood, but seemed to see directly into his soul. "The crown demands sacrifices," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Personal desires must be set aside for the good of the kingdom. A king belongs not to himself, but to his people." Michal rose from her chair, moving closer, until he could smell the subtle fragrance of jasmine in her hair. "But what happens to the man beneath the crown? Does he disappear entirely, or does he simply wait, hoping someday to be seen and understood?" Her words hit him like arrows finding their mark. The careful barriers he had maintained around his heart began to crumble, and before he could stop himself, his hand reached out to touch her face. Her skin was soft as silk, warm with life and possibility. She didn't pull away, and in her eyes he saw not just understanding, but something that looked dangerously like reciprocation. "Michal," he whispered, her name a prayer on his lips. "You see me as no one else has. With you, I'm not just a king carrying impossible burdens. I'm myself." She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing for a moment as if savoring the contact. "And you see me as more than just a merchant's daughter to be traded for political advantage," she replied softly. "With you, I feel alive in ways I never imagined possible." The admission hung between them like lightning before thunder. They both knew the implications, the dangers, the impossibility of what was happening. She was promised to another. He was bound by duty and law, and yet the connection between them seemed to transcend all earthly considerations. "This is madness," Saul said, though his hand remained on her face, his thumb tracing the delicate line of her cheekbone. "You're to be married, and I have responsibilities that cannot be abandoned for personal desire." "Is it madness?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Or is it the first real thing either of us has felt in years? I've been paraded before suitors like a prize to be won, never asked what I wanted, never consulted about my own heart. And you've carried the weight of a kingdom, while your own needs were ignored and forgotten." Her words stripped away his last defenses. Here was someone who understood not just his position, but his humanity, who saw him as both king and man without being overwhelmed by either. The loneliness that had been his constant companion seemed to evaporate in her presence, replaced by a warmth and connection he had thought lost forever. "If we continue down this path," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of prophecy, "there will be consequences for both of us. The laws that govern kings are written in stone and sealed with blood." Michal's hand covered his, pressing it more firmly against her face. "Then perhaps," she said with quiet courage, "some laws are worth breaking. Some connections are worth the risk. Some moments of genuine feeling are worth whatever price must be paid." The die was cast. In that sun-drenched library, surrounded by the wisdom of ages, King Saul made the choice that would define the rest of his reign and ultimately lead to his destruction. He leaned forward and kissed her, pouring years of loneliness and desperate hunger into that moment of contact. She responded with equal passion, her arms encircling his neck as if she could anchor him to this moment of perfect understanding. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing heavily, their faces flushed with the heat of forbidden desire. The rational part of Saul's mind screamed warnings, reminding him of his duties, his kingdom, his God. But the part of him that had been starved for genuine connection, for someone who could see and love the man beneath the crown, had awakened and would not be silenced again. "What happens now?" Michal asked, her voice trembling with the magnitude of what they had just acknowledged. Saul looked into her eyes and saw his own fate reflected there. Beautiful, dangerous, and ultimately destructive. "Now," he said with the grim certainty of a man who has chosen his path regardless of where it leads, "we discover what price love demands from kings, and whether we're strong enough to pay it." Outside the library window, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, and the first rumbles of thunder echoed across the hills of Gibeah like the voice of an angry god. The storm that had been building over Gibeah finally broke that night, unleashing torrents of rain that hammered against the palace walls like the fists of an angry deity. King Saul stood at his chamber window, watching lightning tear across the sky, while his mind churned with plans as dangerous as the tempest outside. 3 weeks had passed since that fateful moment in the library. 3 weeks of stolen glances, whispered conversations, and a growing obsession that now consumed every fiber of his being. The diplomatic mission should have ended days ago, but Saul had found excuse after excuse to extend the negotiations. New trade routes to discuss, additional security arrangements to finalize, complex territorial agreements that required careful review. Ahimelech seemed pleased with the king's thoroughness, unaware that each delay was motivated not by statecraft, but by an uncontrollable hunger for his daughter's presence. "The men grow restless, my lord." Abner's voice cut through the sound of rain as the commander entered the chamber. Water dripped from his cloak. He had been making his rounds of the night watch. "The Philistines have been probing our defenses more boldly each day. We need to march soon, or they'll think us weak." Saul turned from the window, his face a mask of royal composure that had become increasingly difficult to maintain. "And what of our guests? The negotiations with Ahimelech are at a crucial stage." "My lord," Abner's weathered features showed concern. "Forgive my boldness, but the men whisper that their king has been distracted. They need to see the warrior who united the tribes, not—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Not what, Abner?" Saul's voice carried a dangerous edge. "Not a man who has lost sight of his duties for other considerations." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Saul's hand moved instinctively to his sword hilt, but Abner was right, and they both knew it. The great king who had forged a nation from fractious tribes was allowing personal desire to cloud his judgment, and the kingdom was beginning to notice. "Leave me," Saul commanded, his voice barely controlled. "I'll address the military situation in the morning." Alone again, Saul's composure cracked. He had been trying to find a way to keep Michal near him permanently, but every solution led to disaster. He could break her betrothal, but that would create enemies and potentially start a war with her intended husband's tribe. He could take her as a concubine, but that would scandal his kingdom and undermine his moral authority. He could. The thought that had been growing in the darkest corners of his mind surfaced again, too terrible to fully acknowledge, yet too persistent to ignore. A soft knock interrupted his dark musings. "Enter," he called, expecting a servant with wine or news from the watch. Instead, Michal slipped into the chamber, her hair damp from the rain and her eyes bright with urgency. "Your Majesty," she whispered, glancing back at the door she had carefully closed behind her. "I had to see you. My father speaks of departing tomorrow. He says the negotiations are complete." The news hit Saul like a physical blow. Tomorrow. She would be gone tomorrow, returned to her father's house, and then delivered to her husband-to-be like a piece of valuable property. The thought filled him with a rage so pure and consuming that for a moment he could barely think. "No," he said, the word coming out harsh and desperate. "I won't let that happen. I can't." Michal moved closer, her face etched with the same desperation he felt. Over the past weeks their relationship had deepened beyond mere attraction. She had become his confidant, the one person who could see past his crown to the lonely, burdened man beneath. And he had become her escape from a life mapped out by others, her glimpse of what love might actually feel like. "What choice do we have?" she asked, pain evident in her voice. I'm bound by contracts made before I was old enough to understand their meaning. And you're a king. Your marriages must serve the kingdom, not your heart." "There is a way," Saul said slowly, the terrible plan that had been forming in his mind finally taking shape. It would require extreme measures, dangerous ones, but it could work. Hope flared in her eyes, even as caution creased her brow. "What do you mean?" Saul moved to his writing table, where maps of the kingdom lay spread beneath flickering oil lamps. His finger traced a route along the eastern border where Philistine raiders had been increasingly active. "Your father's caravan will travel this road tomorrow. It passes through a valley where bandits and enemy raiders often strike. If something were to happen to the caravan, if you were to disappear, presumed captured or killed." The implications hung heavy in the rain-soaked air. Michal's eyes widened as she understood what he was suggesting. "You would stage my death, make it appear that raiders attacked us." "Not just appear," Saul said grimly. "It would have to be real, convincing. Some of your father's guards would have to die to make it believable, but you would be spirited away to safety, hidden until the right moment to reveal that you survived and sought sanctuary in my kingdom." The plan was monstrous in its deception, requiring the deaths of innocent men to satisfy one man's obsession. Yet as Saul outlined the details, he found himself justifying each terrible aspect. The guards who would die were mercenaries anyway, their lives already forfeit to violence. The deception served a greater good, uniting two hearts that truly understood each other. The kingdom would benefit from having a queen who truly knew the king's mind and heart. "The risks," Michal began, but Saul cut her off, "are worth taking. I've spent my entire reign making calculated risks for the good of Israel. This time I'm making one for us." She was quiet for a long moment, studying his face in the lamplight. Rain continued to lash the windows, and thunder rolled across the hills like the voice of divine judgment. Finally she nodded slowly. "If we do this," she said quietly, "there can be no turning back. We'll be bound together by deception and blood." "Can you live with that?" Saul reached for her hands, gripping them with desperate intensity. "I can live with anything except losing you. I've been a king for years, but with you, for the first time, I feel alive. I feel complete." "Then we'll do it," she whispered, sealing both their fates with those 4 words. The rest of the night was spent in careful planning. Saul would send a small unit of his most trusted soldiers, disguised as Philistine raiders, to attack the caravan. The assault would be swift and brutal, leaving just enough survivors to tell the tale of Michal's apparent death. Meanwhile, other agents would spirit her away to a safe house in the hills, where she would remain hidden until the mourning period passed and she could be discovered as a sole survivor seeking the king's protection. As dawn broke grey and sullen over the storm-battered landscape, Saul stood once again at his window. Below in the courtyard, Ahimelech's caravan was preparing for departure. Pack animals were being loaded, guards checked their weapons, and somewhere among the bustling activity, Michal was preparing for a journey that would end in staged death and rebirth. The king who had once been chosen by God to lead his people had made a choice that would stain his soul forever. But as he watched the woman he had come to love more than his kingdom prepare to risk everything for their forbidden connection, Saul felt no regret. He had found something worth damning himself for, and he would pay any price to keep it. The die was cast, the trap was set, and before the sun reached its zenith, blood would flow to satisfy a king's obsession. In choosing love over duty, desire over righteousness, Saul had stepped onto a path that would lead inexorably to his destruction. But in that moment, watching Michal's graceful figure move through the courtyard below, he couldn't bring himself to care about the consequences. Some hungers, he had learned, were stronger than wisdom, stronger than duty, and stronger than the fear of divine retribution, and his hunger for Michal had become the most powerful force in his life, consuming everything else like a fire that burns, until nothing remains but ash and memory. 6 months had passed since the bloody deception in the valley where Michal was supposed to have died. The official story had worked perfectly. Philistine raiders had attacked Ahimelech's caravan, killing most of the guards and taking captives, including the merchant's beloved daughter. The kingdom mourned the tragedy. Alliances were strained but not broken, and King Saul publicly vowed vengeance against the raiders who had committed such an atrocity. But in the hidden chambers beneath the palace of Gibeah, a different story was unfolding. Michal lived in luxurious captivity, attended by servants sworn to absolute secrecy, waiting for the day when she could emerge as Saul's queen. The king visited her whenever possible, stealing hours from his royal duties to lose himself in her arms and forget the weight of his crown. Yet even in these moments of stolen paradise, the poison of their deception was slowly consuming everything good in Saul's kingdom. The first crack in the foundation appeared when Jonathan returned from a scouting mission along the Philistine border. The young prince's face was grim as he stood before his father in the throne room, his armor still bearing the dust of hard travel. Around them, the morning court session continued, but Saul could sense trouble in his son's demeanor. "Father," Jonathan said quietly, "I bring disturbing news from the eastern territories. The raids attributed to Philistines, some of the survivors' stories don't match. The attackers knew too much about our caravans, spoke Hebrew without accent, and fought with techniques known only to our own forces." Saul's blood turned to ice, but his expression remained carefully neutral. "What are you suggesting, my son?" "I'm suggesting that someone within our kingdom may be orchestrating these attacks for their own purposes. The assault on Ahimelech's caravan in particular seems calculated, too precise to be random banditry." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a sacrificial fire. Saul could see suspicion growing in Jonathan's eyes, and he knew that his brilliant son was connecting pieces of a puzzle that could destroy everything. The prince, who had always been his pride and closest advisor, was becoming a threat to the secret that consumed his life. "Such accusations require proof," Saul said carefully. "Until then, they remain speculation that could damage our relationships with allied tribes." But Jonathan's investigation continued, and worse, other problems were multiplying like locusts in summer. The kingdom's military preparedness had declined during Saul's distraction with Michal. Philistine forces had grown bolder, pushing deeper into Israelite territory, while the king's attention was focused on his hidden love affair. Economic agreements had been neglected, causing trade disputes with neighboring peoples. The unified kingdom that Saul had built through years of careful leadership was beginning to fracture. The breaking point came when Abner requested a private audience, his weathered face grave with the weight of unwelcome truths. The old commander had served loyally through every campaign, and his respect meant more to Saul than the approval of all his other advisers combined. "My lord," Abner began without preamble, "I must speak plainly, as befits an old soldier. The kingdom is in danger, not from external enemies but from within. Your recent distraction has created vulnerabilities that our enemies are exploiting. The men whisper that their king has lost his focus, possibly his mind." Saul's hands gripped the arms of his throne until his knuckles went white. "Careful, Abner. Your loyalty has earned you the right to speak freely, but there are limits." "Then let me approach those limits, my lord. 3 of our border fortresses have fallen while you've been occupied with mysterious private matters. Trade routes have been disrupted because negotiations were abandoned halfway through, and now Jonathan investigates attacks that seem to have been carried out by our own people." "What madness has taken hold of you?" The word madness struck like a dagger to the heart. Saul rose from his throne, his tall frame radiating the dangerous energy of a cornered predator. "You forget yourself, Commander. I am still your king." "That's exactly what I'm trying to preserve," Abner replied with the courage of absolute loyalty. "The king I've served for 15 years, the man who united the tribes and built a nation from chaos. That man seems to have disappeared, replaced by someone I don't recognize, someone who makes decisions based on personal considerations rather than the good of the kingdom." The confrontation ended with Abner's dismissal from court, but his words echoed in Saul's mind like the tolling of funeral bells. That evening, as he made his way to Michal's hidden chambers, the weight of his choices pressed down on him like the stones of a collapsing building. Michal was waiting for him, beautiful as always, but even she could see the strain etched in his features. The months of secrecy had taken their toll on her as well. The vibrant, intelligent woman he had fallen in love with had grown pale and listless from her confinement, like a flower trying to bloom in darkness. "My love," she said softly, reaching for his hands, "you look terrible. What's troubling you?" "Everything," he admitted, the words pouring out like blood from a mortal wound. "The kingdom suffers while I chase shadows of happiness. My son suspects the truth about your death. My commanders question my judgment, and our enemies grow stronger with each day of my neglect." Michal's face grew pale as she understood the implications. "Are we discovered?" "Not yet, But Jonathan is clever and persistent. It's only a matter of time before he uncovers evidence of what really happened to your father's caravan. And when he does..." Saul couldn't finish the sentence. When Jonathan learned that his father had orchestrated murder to steal another man's bride, the revelation would destroy not just Saul's reign, but his son's love and respect. "Then we must act quickly," Michal said with desperate determination. "Announce that I survived the attack, that I was found wandering in the desert. Make me your queen openly, and the deception becomes just a romantic rescue." But Saul shook his head bitterly. It's too late for that. Too much blood has been spilled, too many lies told, and there are witnesses among my own men who know the truth about what happened in that valley. If they ever speak, the trap he had built to capture love had become his own prison. Every move to protect their secret required new deceptions, new betrayals, new acts of violence that stained his soul darker. The kingdom he had spent his life building was crumbling around him, sacrificed on the altar of an obsession that had consumed his judgment and honor. That night, alone in his royal chambers, Saul knelt before the altar where he had once sought God's guidance. But the silence that answered his prayers felt different now, not the patient quiet of divine wisdom, but the terrible emptiness of abandonment. He had chosen human desire over divine will, and the consequences were spreading through his kingdom like plague. The next morning brought news that confirmed his worst fears. A messenger arrived from the prophet Samuel, carrying words that struck terror into Saul's heart. "The Lord has rejected you as king over Israel because you have rejected his commandments and followed the devices of your own heart. Another has been chosen to take your place, a man after God's own heart." Standing in the dawn light that streamed through his palace windows, King Saul finally understood the true price of his obsession. He had traded everything: his kingdom, his relationship with God, his son's respect, his people's welfare, for a love that now felt more like poison in his veins. The crown that had once felt heavy with responsibility now felt worthless, a hollow mockery of the divine calling he had abandoned. Michal emerged from the shadows where she had been listening, her face streaked with tears. "This is my fault," she whispered. "I should never have agreed to your plan. I should have married as my father wished and let you rule as God intended." Saul looked at the woman who had cost him everything and felt the terrible irony of his situation. He still loved her, perhaps more desperately than ever, but that love had become a curse that destroyed everything it touched. The passion that had seemed like salvation had proven to be damnation, and there was no path back to the light. "No," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of absolute defeat. "The choice was mine. I was the king. I was supposed to choose duty over desire, the kingdom over my own heart. Instead, I chose to become a man who murders innocent guards and deceives his own people for love. God was right to reject me." What a devastating end to King Saul's tragic journey. But before we part ways, I want to hear from you. Have you ever witnessed or experienced how unchecked desire can lead to destruction? Maybe not on this epic scale, but in your own life or someone close to you. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Sometimes the most powerful lessons come from recognizing these patterns in our own stories. And if this tale of power, obsession, and downfall moved you, hit that like button and subscribe. There are more incredible true stories of history's most complex figures waiting to be told. What did this story teach you about the balance between following your heart and doing what's right? I genuinely want to know your perspective because these ancient lessons still echo in our modern world. The kingdom of Israel would eventually fall, just as the prophet had foretold. Saul would die in battle, broken by the weight of his choices, while his beloved Michal would fade into history as a footnote to a king's obsession. The great empire he had built would crumble, torn apart by the very human weaknesses that had consumed its founder. In the end, King Saul's story became a warning etched in blood and tears across the pages of history, a testament to how even the mightiest can fall when they allow desire to overcome duty, and how the most destructive battles are often fought not against external enemies, but against the darkness within our own hearts. Don't let this be the end of our journey together. If these stories of power, passion, and the human condition fascinate you as much as they do me, there's so much more to explore. Hit that subscribe button, not just because I'm asking, but because you deserve to dive deeper into the incredible, complex, and often tragic stories that shaped our world. Every week, we uncover these hidden gems of human drama that make today's stories seem pale in comparison. And please share your own experiences in the comments. Have you seen obsession destroy someone's life? Have you faced moments where desire and duty pulled you in opposite directions? Your stories matter. Your insights add depth to these ancient tales, and this community grows stronger when we learn from each other's experiences. Like this video if it made you think, made you feel, or taught you something new. Together, we're not just learning history. We're understanding the timeless patterns of human nature that connect us all across the centuries.